Charles, I don't know if you caught 60 Minutes on Sunday evening, but they did a piece on the border. A particular section of the border, about 60 miles east of San Diego, where there's been a little entrance to America created that is used by smugglers with frequency. That's certainly the observation of the gentleman that was interviewed by the 60 Minutes correspondent who owns 15 acres of property there and whose property, like, for example, ranchers in Eagle Pass, Texas, have had their properties overrun by people coming into this country illegally. Here's the description of this entrance point as the 60 Minutes correspondent is just watching and filming, as are border security, by the way, just watching this occur as migrants come in, mainly but not exclusively Chinese migrants, per the report. And they're just ushered into awaiting CBP vehicles. And thus the process begins where they are distributed among all 50 border states. Take a listen.
Just after sunrise, we saw the first group of migrants make their way from Mexico through a gap between the 30-foot steel border fence and rocks, ducking under a bit of razor wire and into the United States. We were surprised to see the number of people coming through from China, nearly 7,000 miles away.
Careful, watch.
Our cameras, and at one point, this armed Border Patrol agent standing 25 feet away, did not deter them. 30 minutes later, a smuggler's SUV raced along the border fence and dropped another group at the same spot. And 30 minutes after that, another group. Over 4 days, we witnessed nearly 600 migrants, adults and children, pass through this hole and onto U.S. soil unchecked. We saw people from India, Vietnam, and Afghanistan.
How did they know about this particular section of the U.S. border, this entrance point, if you will?
We wondered how all of these migrants knew about this particular entryway into California. The answer was in their hands.
How do you know about that? Oh, Douyin, okay, TikTok. Oh, you learned on TikTok. Yeah.
TikTok is a social media platform created in China. The post we found had step-by-step instructions for hiring smugglers and detailed directions to that hole we visited. We were struck by just how orderly and routine it all seemed. The migrants walked about a half mile down a dirt road and waited in line for U.S. Border Patrol to arrive so they could surrender.
Yeah, that TikTok post was signed Sincerely President Xi, providing all the instructions and directions. And to that end, this conversation that 60 Minutes correspondent had with an asylum attorney, immigration attorney, specializing in asylum cases. And the issue, of course, is, well, a lot of those asylum seekers are denied asylum. And we've talked about this before with respect to the border, because what's new in this story except the volume? And but Chinese Communist Party won't take them back. So they just de facto stay if their country of origin won't accept them?
Well, yeah. Based on our review of data from Immigration and Customs Enforcement, there are at least 36,000 Chinese who have been ordered by U.S. courts to leave the country. But China is notorious for not taking back its citizens, and the U.S. can't force China to accept them.
So then what happens if they have a failed claim but they can't go back to China?
That's a very good question. They're stuck in this limbo.
Uh-huh. And what about, this gap that's basically the size of a small doorway, this gap in the fencing where the CPB officer is watching just as the 60 Minutes cameras are? It's very orderly, she says. This is why all this invasion talk. Is it an invasion or is it a federal government-sponsored importation? Could you close that gap? Could you close that small doorway in the wall? Could you take that spot, that entrance point offline? Well, yeah, but we need congressional action to do it.
They know that thing is there. And we all been telling them, hey, when this thing going to quit over here? You got to call Washington, D.C., that's what they say.
So we did. U.S. Customs and Border Protection told us their agents don't have authority to stop people from coming through gaps like this one and can only arrest them after they've entered illegally. As for closing that gap, they said it is on their priority list, but would require money from Congress.
I mean, if you see this gap in the fence and you're waiting for congressional cash to block this spot, the whole thing is theater of the absurd, as is this idea that Customs and Border Protection should serve like a doorman at a nightclub, as opposed to you're not coming in, and also we're going to take our own initiative to shut this down. But that's not what the leadership of this country wants.
How much could it cost to shut it down?
Clearly, I mean, it's nothing. I mean, you could have any contractor in the country fill in that spot in an hour.
Yeah.
So you can understand the skepticism of a wide swath of the American public when it comes to this bipartisan compromise, quote unquote, on immigration and border security. For more on the topic, we're pleased to be joined by Noah Rothman, senior writer at National Review, author of the book The Rise of the New Puritans, Fighting Back Against Progressives' War on Fun. Noah, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So, I mean, what does that, sort of summary through clips of the 60 Minutes piece, I think I got the highlights. What does that say about the seriousness of our political leadership when it comes to border security?
Well, it tells you they're not serious, first of all, obviously. I don't think anybody can look at this president's record, this administration's record, and say he's got a real, affinity for border security. It's also something about the inefficiency of government. The same thing that you have, you've got a pothole on your road, and you can't fix it, and you can't get the municipality to fix it, and if you were to fill it up, you'd be charged with a misdemeanor. This is government for you. It's not an efficient enterprise. Saying that a contractor could do it better, obviously. They quite could. They certainly could. They need authorization to do it. That's just the nature of the beast. And that's why you need new laws. I heard Senator John Barrasso say we don't need new laws. The president has all the authority he can to shut down the border. And to a certain extent, that's true. He's just not enforcing border security. But it's not as though we don't need new statutes. Republicans acknowledge as much. That's why they're pressing H.R. 2. H.R. 2 is an immigration law. They say we need to start with immigration laws. Well, if the president doesn't need new laws, why are we pressing H.R. 2? Because of course you need new laws. Of course you need to tighten asylum seeking. Of course you need to increase capacity in detention facilities, create new standards for asylum seekers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Republicans know that. This has just become a new talking point, and I don't think it's a helpful one. I frankly think that this bill is probably as good as they're going to get from a Democratic Congress that doesn't want to enforce immigration law, as you acknowledge, as I acknowledge, as ABC News acknowledges. This is a party that doesn't want to enforce the law. They want Republicans to rescue them from the quicksand they've parked themselves in. That's why the GOP has them over a barrel. They've got them on the run. I don't understand why they wouldn't press their advantage. It's like watching McClellan at Antietam. Just give them a punch on the nose, get them on the ropes, and back off. Why? What are you doing? Get everything you can out of these people. They're painted themselves into a corner. Make them pay for their weak politics.
Yeah, but the question becomes, and I think this is where the disagreement is what has been proposed, what was rolled out on Sunday afternoon, making them pay and making the country safer and seizing this moment to do something that is substantial, if not transformative, at the border. And a lot of Republicans, conservatives, border security hawks are saying, no, it's not.
Yeah, listen, we can all quibble over the details, and I think we should, frankly, because the details are extremely important in this bill. And just as an overview, to take a 30,000-foot perspective, and as I wrote in that piece, on a hawkish bill that meets the Dovish GOP. If you were to park this in front of somebody in 2004 and say Democrats did this, Democrats gave you an all-enforcement bill. There's no amnesty here. There's no citizenship here. There's no green cards for illegal residents here. All enforcement. Plus, we're giving a lot of money to our advertisers, to our allies abroad and partners abroad who are eagerly fighting our enemies for us. And you say the Democrats did this? You'd say the Republicans were the dominant political force in this country. But they're not. They've got like a 2-seat majority in the House, and they've managed to get this out of Democrats. It is quite a coup and a significant concession from a party that does not want to do this. It must be repeated. They do not want to do any of this. It's their weak policies that have forced them into a corner. So when you talk about the details, a lot of this stuff is in H.R. 2. It's almost like it was a baseline for it. Again, boosting detention facilities.
Okay, I
could go through the litany, but
no, I mean, yeah, I know we've done that over the last 24 hours too. But I mean, but for example, to me, the poison pill in the legislation. Get your reaction to this. Is the presidential emergency declaration for up to 45 days, and given our previous experience with endless series of emergency declarations during COVID, from at both the federal level as well as COVIDian governors like our very own in Illinois, so all these provisions meet presidential discretion, and what would stop Joe Biden from one 45-day declaration after another when it comes to any of the provisions in terms of implementation?
Yeah. Well, some of them aren't subject to judicial review, which is actually distinct from H.R. 2, which does allow it to go to appellate courts. Some of which were responsible for issuing national injunctions on any Trump administration policy in relation to immigration. So it just sort of erases that backstop. But I am somewhat sympathetic to the idea that the president needs certain discretionary authority in the event of national emergencies, which are unforeseeable. So I can accept as a level of
but also the national. Sorry to interrupt, but the national emergency, quote unquote. I mean, there's also no limiting principle, as we've seen, to that declaration.
Well, the limiting principle, as I understand it, is insofar as we're talking about how the Department of Homeland Security can functionally shut down the border after 5,000 crossers per day on average, or 8,500 migrants in a single day.
Right.
So, I mean, that one is an automatic. That automatically comes into effect, as far as I understand it. The waiving provision is in there, but it's complicated, and I don't think it necessarily, from what I've heard from people who have reviewed this bill over for the precisely 24 hours that we've had to review it, I think 36 now.
Yeah.
Suggests that it's not like something that the president can just simply appeal to without meeting these metrics. And if it beats these metrics, this 8,500 per day thing seems pretty ironclad. It doesn't go through the courts. It is, and the president is saying, "I'm desperate for you to do this." Like, he's not going to just immediately invoke this 45-day appeal because he wants this. That's the thing. He's begging for somebody to say, "Please enforce the border," because he wants the out. Democrats have cultivated a lot of open borders advocates in their constituent groups. They don't want them to do this. They don't want them to enforce the law. The president needs to say, "Look, Congress made me do it," in ways that no executive order in the future or today can circumvent. So he would enforce it. He wants to be forced to enforce it. He's begging Republicans to make him enforce the law so he can have some sort of cover, political cover. I think Republicans would be foolish not to give it to him, especially if you want this abject crisis that we all agree is a crisis to stop today. 8,500 sounds like a lot for a day, and it is.
Yeah.
But it's not a lot compared to the 302,043 migrant encounters that we had in December alone. It's a crisis. It needs to be addressed today.
No, right, but the argument is that so you're going to slow the flow, but you're not changing. You're not fundamentally changing what's occurring. You're just extending the timeline over which it's occurring.
That is not true, because if you're talking about the details of this bill, it provides new standards for asylum seekers to meet credible fear, which we actually would recognize as credible fear, not this bureaucratic double talk. It boosts the amount of judges and, crucially, judges' teams to beat back this obscene backlog. Money that is released for electronic monitoring and curfews and deportation flights, by the way, where the funds are not released until you meet them. I think it's like 1,500, something like that. And it speeds the process of citizenship and immigration to handle some of these more rote claims involving unaccompanied minors that clog up the courts. All of this stuff does change the process. All of this stuff does speed up the process. And it's not catch and release, in particular with this changing of the parole loophole to change the statute around parole. So no executive, Republican or Democrat, all of them have abused this. So no president can just determine what constitutes a parolee, an eligible parolee. It really does put a significant, in my reading of it, put a significant pressure on the catch and release problem. H.R. 2 does a lot of that too. But some of this is a little bit more strict in this bill than even the H.R. 2 statutory language.
Well, I mean, but the argument for H.R. 2 and the argument that's been made by people like Tom Homan and other with experience at the border is that remain in safe third country, remain in Mexico, whatever you want to call it. I mean, that deals with 3/4 of the flow right there. So all of this is superfluous if you just through executive action reinstitute or remain in Mexico.
Well, yeah. So a lot of that's basically Title 42 policy, and according to the language in this bill, this compromise bill, that basically is Title 42, and it kicks in when we say, all right, we've hit these arbitrary numbers here, then we have to re-implement Title 42. Now Republicans can say, look, you should do it immediately. You should do it with one border crosser. Just do it permanently.
Right.
That's what you would get if you had united government behind Republicans. You don't have united government behind Republicans. So what Republicans can do is either bank what they've gotten from Democrats, which is, again, nothing I've ever seen from Democrats. Or you could roll the dice and say, well, maybe we can get a better deal out of Democrats, because there will be Democrats. Unless you think Democrats are going to be raptured out of existence on January 20th, 2025, you're going to have to deal with Democrats. So let's say, okay, well, maybe we'll get a better deal when Trump is president, Republicans retake the Senate and the House. That's a huge gamble. It's a gigantic gamble, and it's not necessarily one I would bank the mortgage on.
Well, the problem, I mean, first of all, a lot, as you conceded, a lot of this could be done by executive action, so you don't need to eliminate Democrats altogether to get a more substantial effort with respect to border security in November. You need to win one office, the presidency. And I am not saying it's a fait accompli, but I'm just saying there are obvious workarounds here. In addition, and that's based on Supreme Court precedent in terms of presidential power at the border. But the other piece of this is this moment, right? I mean, so you have the nation transfixed on this issue. And if you take half a loaf 8 months before a national election, then this dissipates, and all politicians on both sides say, we solved it, we addressed it, we're solutionists. And to try to resuscitate that subsequently is going to be difficult politically.
Yeah, well, that's I think it's a honestly, to say it outright, which Donald Trump has, is a rather cynical maneuver to say, listen, we can't actually solve this problem because then we've solved the problem, not solved the problem.
Well,
you know what I'm saying. Make a significant dent in it. At which point you give the Democratic president an out. Listen, I really don't think that voters are going to look at the border and say, well, Joe Biden doesn't own this thing anymore. I mean, that's pretty baked in. What it's going to do, however, is give nervous Democrats a reason to come home to Joe Biden. And he's an unpopular president, and I can understand why Republicans would balk at that opportunity. It's nevertheless an acute crisis, so you're balancing your political objectives versus national security objectives, and I would side with the latter.
Well,
I'm sorry.
No, well, I mean, you're also in this sort of fool me once, shame on me, fool me twice, because, I mean, we just, this is the third term of the Joe Obama administration, and I mean, we had a president who Biden served as his VP, who moved that DACA program, conceding that he believed it was unconstitutional. And federal courts later agreed with him. But the point is, these are ends justify the means politicians. These are not rule of law politicians. The law is a workaround for politicians generally, I grant you, but specifically on this issue for that party. So, I mean, you can understand, and I think it's healthy, the skepticism that exists in terms of enforcement.
Well, yeah, I share that skepticism, but that's why you change the statutory language so that the courts are no longer a refuge. The reason why you can't do a lot of this stuff by executive order that Obama attempted to do, is because the Republicans ended up changing the statutory language, changing the law. And no president can come back around and say, okay, well, I'm just going to ignore this law. You can until the courts have access to it. And then they say, no, I'm sorry, we're going to enjoin that. This is beyond your legal authority. The executive power, and when it comes to immigration, is extremely broad. It's extremely discretionary. And it should not be.
Well, that's part of the problem. And part of the problem, too, is Jonathan Turley had a good piece in The Hill this week, the George Washington law professor, about open borders and closed courts, talking about Congress repeatedly trying to impose limits through legislative mandates and told they can't sue to enforce mandatory provisions. States are told they can't sue to secure their own borders. And so, as he writes, it reduces our system to a mere Potemkin village, a facade of constitutional powers with little ability to protect them. In other words, if the federal government decides they want the fire to burn, then they can let it burn.
I mean, I'm not a lawyer or a judge, so I couldn't weigh in on the constitutional merits of whatever argument, depending on the court or the judge that hears those. But that's still an argument for tightening up the statute. And it's still an argument for hemming in the president and compelling him to enforce law. I've been very frustrated with Congress watching them observe this crisis as though they're just spectators to it. It's gotten to the point now where we're involving armed factions of the military in a dispute between the states and the federal government and the courts, and Congress is just sitting there saying, well, maybe we'll write a law. They should be threatening the administration's priorities. They should be using the power of the purse and subpoena power, which are the only things that have any capacity to induce behavioral changes on the part of the presidency, to use them to make the president do his job, to threaten what he holds dear. That is sort of something that is in the purview of Congress. Yes, they should be changing statute. Yes, they should be holding out carrots as well as sticks. But I don't see any sticks. The sticks need to be there, too. Go after the president's green funding priorities or whatever the heck student loan forgiveness. I don't know. Whatever it is he decides that he needs in this particular moment, and say, until you force the law, this is what we're going to do. Oh, and also, we have this other law that we'd like you to sign into law. And these are the things that are in Congress's purview as the first branch of government, and just doesn't do it. And I'm sorry, I'm very frustrated with Republicans who are sitting back and saying we don't need new laws when they argue that we need new laws. Of course we need new laws. We need to tighten the statutory language to force the president to do what is his job. He's not inclined to do his job. Congress needs to make him do it.
Well, I agree, and the power of the purse point is a critical one as well. The step they have not taken. I completely agree with that. Noah Rothman, senior writer at National Review, author of The Rise of the New Puritans: Fighting Back Against Progressives' War on Fun. Noah, thank you as always.
Thank you.
Noah Rothman joined us on the Turnkey.Pro answer line. And coming up at 7:37, we'll turn our attention to all things Illinois related when wirepoints.org's Ted Dabrowski joins us. That's 7:37. Now we check the headlines with Mike Scott.
Dan and Charles, 7:32 in Chicago. Freezing fog out there and 35